Greetings, folks. Most recently I've been monstering around Europa in the big fat shark here. Bit of overkill involved in that. It's fairly souped up. My enemies aren't really at the same calibre, and it got me thinking that I should take some hydrogen powered small grid ships to Europa. They're a bit more evenly matched, the locals. Use those to pick on some bases and whatnot. So of course, to get a small grid to Europa they need a bit of a lift on some sort of jump capable ship, which I've got right here, which is why we're dealing with King Shark in the first place. It's got two nice flat flanks that I can attach a couple of little ships to and then jump them from the moon to Europa. That is the plan. So King Shark's got a bit of feisty firepower now. Added some extra beam weapons recently while hanging out on Europa. But today it's going to have a couple of ships hanging like remora from its flanks. And one of the ships in question is my newfangled Spruce Goose here. So this will be a build video for the Spruce Goose and its shakedown cruise, which was being towed to Europa on the Shark. So this is the finished product parked on Europa with the front ramp down. So it's a little dropship for about 8 troops. If you want to get 8 of your troops anywhere in the local part of the solar system, you can cart them there with this. It's got a pretty nice range. It can handle all sorts of environments. Carry 8 guys. It's got a survival kit stashed in the back there. Plenty of fuel tanks. The whole thing's built out of fuel tanks. Double shields. It's got some lockers there with guns and hydrogen and whatnot in, so your 8 guys can charge into battle. They can die, they can reappear back here, they can grab a gun, they can grab a bottle, can charge back out again. They'll be good to go. Rock and ice extractors down the back, shield emitter down the back. So it's got a drill mounted on the back there, nano drill, can drill its own ice, and a harpoon, which we'll go into later. So here it is compared to a large grid ship. So it's a pretty big small grid ship. The mothership is a compact large grid ship, but it's almost as wide. So it's a bulky pregnant whale of a small grid ship. So that's a false cabin up above on the neck. It's got a Firefly sort of shaped design. There's that harpoon I mentioned. Harpoon with a camera, so that's a tow cable arrangement. You can back up to a paralysed enemy ship, harpoon it, drag it back to base for salvaging. Below that is the drill. The harpoon's the small one, drill's the big one. So it's got aerodynamic surfaces to help it glide. It's got a couple of regular turrets mounted on the top, which are good when it's down on the ground and needs to defend itself from air targets. And it's got laser cannons, 4 lasers on the front, and 1 tail end Charlie laser as well. So it's got vectored thrust in the wings with big chunky hinges, big tough hinges that aren't too clangy. So it's got hydrogen on the wings, it's got jets on the wings, and it's got ions on the wings. So it's blazing away with a bunch of them. It's got its jets on and its hydrogen. It's got 5 big hydrogen thrusters just for lift there. Question is, what's underneath the skin? This is the start of it, with the fighter cockpit at the front and a row of 4 medium cargo bays going back to a conveyor junction that then has the survival kit. Those spaces I have there, they're build and repair units from a mod. So I've got those as spaces. There's some engines and some generators tacked on there to create a kind of T-junction of big junctions in the middle there. So this cockpit ends up hidden under the armour. The real cockpit isn't in the nose where the sort of goose head is. That's just a fake cockpit with batteries inside it and some windows. The real one's stashed in a slightly safer place further back. And so you've got the cargo half, and then the rear half is just a bunch of fuel generators. This ship has a ton of fuel generators and a decent amount of engines so that it can power lasers and shields. It's a very hydrogen sort of ship. So here's the row of batteries that are then going on next to that. So that's the roof of the ship in all its substance. You always want plenty of batteries, I find. Never have too many batteries. They're heavy, but they're hard to destroy. So, battery armour. So here I've run a row of conveyor down the side there, and I'm starting to put a wall of tanks. And that's the basis for this ship. It's a big flying box of a dropship, but the skin is made out of fuel tanks and not blocks, so it's got an extra long range. So the placement on that survival kit stays the same. So if you remember where the survival kit is in the middle of the finished product, you've got the back half here, which is getting filled up with fuel tanks and more fuel tanks. It's got a few gadgets in there. It's got the ore detector, some gyros, some of those fuel generators there, but mostly it's just shoehorned full of fuel tanks down the back there. And then it's the front half that I use as the little troop carrying area. Considered having a skinny vehicle in it, but it's just not that much practical use when you've got an aircraft. Do you really need a motorbike? Pops out of your aircraft? It's a novelty, but anyway, it never happened. So 2 large fuel tanks, but a metric buttload of the small fuel tanks, so huge fuel capacity in general, and the ability to turn ice into fuel very quickly using all those generators there. So it's a very independent ship. It's only got a survival kit as far as constructing things goes, but it can drill its own ice. It can fill up a bunch of containers with ice, and it can then quickly process that ice into more fuel and hold a lot of fuel. So it's quite a long range independent ship that can get about out on its own. Giant walls of fuel tank, floor made out of fuel tank, roof made out of batteries and cargo. Almost nothing by way of armour put on this ship yet. This is just an organs first build from the inside out. So rows of white fuel tanks down the guts there, just for a bit of variety. It's basically filling up the back section with just fuel, and there's a handful of gadgets in there. Took the survival kit out for a bit so that I could build all around it more easily. So if you've got a very basic servo going on, you probably don't want to run this ship because it's full of complicated fuel tank interconnections and cargo interconnections. So it might be laggy on a very busy server, multiplayer online server, that kind of thing. You wouldn't want to go with it. But playing around on my own server, it's fine. Making any issues. It's a condensed wodge of very busy conveyors in this area, but it's only a small grid ship. It's nothing like the chug that might get caused by a leviathan of a ship. So finishing off the floor, that's the sum total of all the fuel tanks in the ship. There's some little small storage mixed in with the piping, and they can just hold a bit of ice. When I fill the ship up with ice, it can filter through into all these little tiny 1-block storage capsules, sit in there until it gets processed into fuel. First appearance of the drawbridge type ramp entry. Very simple half-wide armor block type of setup. I haven't gone with the blast door, which is 1 thick. It's a big enough small grid ship, but even so, a 1 thick ramp just looks very thick and bulky, whereas this half-wide armor plate looks about right. Looks like it's solid, but it looks like a swinging ramp plate. So I put a battery right in front of the cockpit for the pilot to stare at, and started to encapsulate the cockpit so that there's just 3 little slots you look through if you want to pop into the cockpit from above. And the way it's shaped from below there, when the ramp's closed, you can walk up the ramp. You can be inside the ship, inside the little cabin there. You can walk up the inside of the ramp when in its closed position, turn around and look up, and you can actually see the cockpit window stashed up in there and get into it and out of it. So you can get in and out of the cockpit and remain in your ship if you're speeding through space. You can get out, you can fiddle with the survival kits and the inventories, and then get back into the cockpit, and the ramp gate is closed. You're zipping through space, it's all good. Or you can get in and out from the outside. It's good to have features. A couple of thrusters appearing on the front there, so I figure out what sort of braking, thrust, etc. I want. One of the 5 big thrusters on the back, and that's a partly constructed large shield generator, so that's the energy shields mod that is also good. That's the harpoon in the old location when I was first figuring out where to put the harpoon. So it's got 2 large shield generators for the energy shield mod. The other one's in the neck, the base of all those batteries there. So 1 at each end of the ship. So hopefully I can't lose 2 of them. So starting to develop the wing stubs now. The Gatling guns and those first downward jets are incorporated into the wing. They're part of the flat surface of the wing. The fuel for the jet feeds through the gun. And those are aerodynamic surfaces, front and back, and some little tail fin style aerodynamics, just in the hope that my jets propelling me forward can then give my wings enough lift to keep me in the air on some cheap electric. You never know. Parachutes have gone in, 6 parachutes in purple boxes just at the front of the wing stubs facing upwards. So that's a different configuration on the harpoon there, with the camera above and a bit of a proto fin in front of it. That fin goes through a few changes. The tail thrusters, 5 on each side, 5 at the back. For the most part, if I want to go forward fast, I'll use the vectored thrust. So those back facing 5 jets, they're just for manoeuvring when I've got the vectored thrust pointing downwards, but I still need to move my ass around and shuffle and land. Basically just for landing manoeuvres like that. So 5 strafers, 5 propulsors, end up with 6 braking jets at the front. There's only 4 there at the moment. Laser cannons have gone in on the front. The goose head is looking a bit more like a goose head. We've got 8 seats, 4 on the floor, 8 on the roof. That's how you want to roll. Nobody knows the difference in 0G. My big flat practical windscreen of aerodynamicness on the front there. Good stuff. So now it's starting to take its eventual shape. So you can see that that original block of cargo and fuel generators that we started with the cockpit on the front, that's all buried in the main body now. So solar cells went on the side, 5 downward engines, and of course some big hinges and another big hydrogen thruster, a big jet engine and a big ion engine out on the vectored thrust. So we've got a bit of everything without having the weight of having lots of redundant engines facing in a lot of different directions. Just about everything's hydrogen, and then there's just those jets and those ions that can be spun around to face backwards, forwards, downwards, the 3 most useful directions for a ship like this. So, pretty much its final incarnation. Some red reactors at the back there, that's 6 little baby reactors, it's mostly hydrogen powered. So I've got 6 reactors, 6 hydrogen engines, and I think 14 fuel generators. Those little feet that it's landed on, those are hydrogen engines. Why waste armour on feet when you can have feet that turn fuel into energy for you? That's what I go around saying, apparently. Still hasn't got its final tail fin at this point, but it's starting to have, well, it's very much got the right general layout. It's starting to have anything. I can see some armoured panels that are going to be changed around, but ultimately that's its final configuration. It's definitely smaller than the large grid ship, but it's a decent sized small grid ship. Can take off at a decent rate. Give it a bit of juice and up she flies. Just got the jet engines on the vectored thrust going, and then the rest is all just the down facing hydrogen engines. Get me a bit of air so that I can play around with settings and try out my vectored thrust. Heading for the moon. So she flies good. No complaints there. Possibly not as economical as some other hydrogen ships with big tanks I could name. The Shark's pretty crazy in that regard. But flying around in an atmosphere is a bad thing if you want to conserve fuel. But it's certainly getting air at a decent speed. I haven't got the forward engines and the upward engines switched off at this point, so this is the hinge movement. This is the little bucking action that you get when you kick the hinge in, which is an interesting part of life. So there I'm just vectoring the jets backwards so that they're giving me a combination of propulsion and lift in the hope of engaging my aerodynamic surfaces and getting some lift out of those. Experimenting on this test flight with what I can get away with in terms of thrust and cruising thrust in particular. So I've just killed the downward hydrogen thrusters to see if there's any kind of electric configuration where it could fly. Skipping ahead, after atmospheric testing, this is higher up in the gravity well. We're at half gravity here. So I'm just using the ions at this point, sort of vectored down and back to push me further into space. So this is electric propulsion. I've got my hydrogen on, I think, and my inertial dampeners on, so I think they're doing some of the work as well. But it's mostly electric. Fluffing around, cruising in the atmosphere. My fuel's gone down to 87. If I'd blasted straight upwards, I'd probably still have 90% of my fuel left. If I'd just gone straight to space. I did want to test out a few jet engines and things. Jet engines aren't working at this height. But overall it's pretty space worthy. It can fly to the moon, no issue. It's definitely easier to go straight up and then fly around the planet. Just take advantage of the 0G to have a lazy cruise. It doesn't low energy atmosphere cruise as well as it might. It's not terrible. And the vectored thrust jets definitely help with takeoff and landing in any kind of atmosphere. But it's destination Europa, so hopefully the jets won't get much of a workout from here on. No issues with the amount of gyros I've got. I don't have to add any of those. It steers alright. Set up my harpoon camera, but I don't know what a safe towing distance is for harpooning. I haven't experimented with a lot of harpoon and tow yet, but I intend to harpoon things from the longest possible range and then set my thrusters to override, because if you start towing something and then you put on your brakes, the thing you're towing is going to hit you in the butt. So, don't know what other features it has. As I say, it's a self-mining kind of setup with that slightly cheaty nano drill down the back. Just means I can go to anywhere that there's ice and refuel this ship, because it generates its own fuel from ice. It can scoop up its own ice with that drill, which makes it nice and independent, which I like. Hydrogen powered ships, pretty good since the hydrogen update. Get some serious range, you can really roam around the solar system with them. So destination Moon. Get up above. The base where this was built is of course on the opposite side of the planet from the Moon. So I have to go up and around the long way. If I was rebuilding this ship, I'd definitely do some things differently. I was reasonably happy with its performance. Once you're up in space, things are pretty easy. With the hinges and the vectorable thrust, I can just point my hydrogen engines backwards, give them a little spurt, and my dampeners off and go zipping whatever direction I want. If I'm not slowing down fast enough, I can hinge them around the other way. Give myself a blast of braking speed. Same with the ion engines, whatever I've got to spare. If I'm low on fuel, I use ion. Low on energy, use hydrogen. So off to the Moon we go to rendezvous with this giant fish here. So this thing was flown in from Europa where it lives, the resident sea monster. And the idea was to fly the Goose to the Moon. At the same time, Brad was flying his Screaming Firehawk to the Moon. And then we can rendezvous with this big shark, clamp onto the side, Millennium Falcon style, use the old gripping clamp maneuver. Stick to those flanks. Give myself a jump drive lift to Europa, which is the moon would be fine for this ship. There's a nice big ice cap on our moon, but so there's two ships docked to either side. A big king shark here, giving us a jump drive tow to Europa, where we can then branch off and do our own thing. We've both got refueling from ice hydrogen based ships, small grid ships. So now they're on Europa, they can run amok and attack enemies here, and just stay here at our very small Europa camp. Pop out of the shark, leave it in orbit. Brad's still helpfully got his bubble shield on, doesn't seem to matter. Look into this little magical slot here. Into the cockpit we pop, and then we can detach and fly down to Europa, making sure dampeners are switched back on because we didn't want them on while I'm being a passenger, that would be rude. Fire all my engines back up. So I'm at 77% fuel here. I think I had some ice on board and actually regenerated a little. Ended up with back over 80 or something when I was down on Europa, but without even really mining anything. Got to do the boogie whenever you flip those hinges. It's going to be interesting when I try some big hinges out on some large grid ships, start flicking things around. Interesting to watch some large grid ships buck like Broncos. So down we fly to Europa. So it's one big fuel tank with a bunch of guns. Obviously a lot of its capability is sacrificed to having a big comfy cabin with lots of chairs for lots of troops and the survival kit and all the mod cons that are in there. But that's alright, not every ship needs to be a little compact fighter jet, makes it interesting. I've adjusted the engines for vertical landings. Having not landed on Europa before, I know it's got nice gentle gravity, but still I want to go in and then just be able to pull up into a nice soft landing. So I've got some extra ions and some extra hydrogen on the wings that I can help achieve that. Won't be using the jets. A nice big crater down on Europa with a little foxhole in it with a stargate in it. So that's how we can throw small grid ships around and just stash them on other planets for use on other planets and moons. Just pop a stargate in a foxhole on said moon and you can always get back there, fly around in your small grid ships on short notice rather than having to do epic jump drive exercises to get everywhere. Once you've got 6 stargates, one on each main body, you're pretty well set. You can go for adventures wherever you like. So we just need to get a gate on, actually we need a gate on the alien world and Titan. We went to the alien world and never built a gate there. We've got a gate system with 4 gates so far, It's just that scummy, disgusting bug world. We haven't bothered to upgrade with the gate yet. So yeah, we've got two small grid, heavily armed ships ready for adventures on Europa. We should be a bit more evenly matched to the things we come across here at any rate. King Shark was just sort of monstering everything and chewing them up and spitting them out. Should be a bit more of a challenge with a smaller ship like this. It's not incredibly heavily armed. It's got 6 forward-facing weapons. Tailgun doesn't really come into any kind of strafing run, whereas Brad's Screaming Firehawk has about 4 forward-facing weapons and then at least 8 turrets. Conventional shooty bang bullet turrets, as I've only got the 2 of those. So it's not the most heavily armed ship, but it's a great dropship if you've got 8 people who need to swarm the enemy, which I don't, but I wanted to build a ship that could do that anyway. Fairly conventional build method in that I built the innards and then just stuck relatively thin layers of armour, aerodynamic panels and general detailing on the outside. It's not a lot of armour, it uses the twin shield methodology that I'm fond of. So here I've got to adjust the vectored thrust a little. The gravity's so low, my vectored thrust will just carry me off. So if I dial it down a bit, jet engine's working surprisingly well on the little moon atmosphere, they do the job. Having downward facing jets, as much as I love going all hydrogen nowadays, never hurts to have some downward facing jet power. Just does wonders for lift. All sorts of places. Pretty well everywhere but the moon. You get some benefit out of having some downward jets. The moon's the one and only location where jets are just completely useless and you can actually have a party with ions right down before you land. Speaking of which, we've got touchdown on Europa. Almost. Very last minute shuffle. Probably can't see it, but my nose is about to be pointing at the tiny little foxhole that I've got set up in this giant crater. That's where the gate comes out. So I want to plonk myself down here and then just be facing that little foxhole, ready to see a moving green blip above me. I think Brad's coming into land. Yes, yet to test the harpoon. That'll be interesting. It's got a decent amount of build and repair. It's got two salvage, weaponized salvage out the front, so it's got a bit of a grinding, break down the enemy area of effect out the front of the nose. And basic build and repair. Vectored thrust. It's a bit of a Spruce Goose. It's a flying pregnant goose. And it's a bit of a heffalump, but it's a dropship. It's a troop ship. It's not a fighter plane. It's a troop transport. Anyway, I'm going to go shoot some things with it at some stage. I hope you like it. It's pretty goofy, it's pretty weird, it's doing its own thing. It's the Spruce Goose.